This is a full circle moment because the government chose to protect the men and their reputations, powerful men in their careers, before protecting countries, before protecting you, before protecting the victims of those in the list, right? And this is the thing. They held more value in the powerful men who were responsible for being in these lists than for the people who would be sacrificed for whatever the governments were willing to do in order to ensure that it wasn't released, right? Because of that, we're here. Because across the political parties, they would rather protect the man than the victims, the man than the truth, the man than justice. Why? Because it was going to harm the reputation and trust within these systems of banks, of the wealthy, right? Corporations, of the government as well, across the country lines. And because of that, we're here. Because they chose to remain silent and allow for these people to continue to infect through the different avenues of fields in our country. And as such, in order for them to not get in trouble, they will sacrifice absolutely everything for them to not be published as being on that list. So why is it that we're here? Because of grape culture, right? Because we don't value women. Because we say that it is more impactful to protect the men, reputations, their careers, their livelihoods above that of the victims. And I want us to understand that how America looked before, how America looked now, does not need to be how it looks in the future. And what this sets a precedent for is for us to hold an amendment that disqualifies any individual who is charged with SA from public office, right? We should not have anyone in public office who has been charged with SA. This is the bare minimum standard, given the fact that the files is literally why we introduced tyranny. Why even Democratic presidents did not maximize on their power when it came to what's happening, because they chose tradition versus actually maximizing on that effort, right? And because of that, we're here. Because you believe that this could not happen here, right? You thought that as long as you didn't consent to martial law, then it wouldn't come. But that's ignorant of how martial law and authoritarianism actually works. They do it, they just don't call it martial law, because then you say, well, this isn't as bad as complete martial law, right? But here's the thing, under martial law, it's not beneficial to an authoritarian regime to cancel elections. What they do is they have you vote, but it won't matter, right? That's an illusion of an election, which is what kept the PRI in power in Mexico for over 70 years. Now, I hate when people are like, don't worry, all tyranny falls, right? But when is it going to fall? It could be years, it could be decades, it could be months. It depends on how brave we are, right? And this is the recognition that what's happening with Jimmy Kimmel. People figure that if they stay silent, then they would not be affected. But silence means that you are literally on their side, right? It means you become a loyalist, and that's how they transition. You know, the shifts between the privilege of the loyalists and those who are fucked, which is those who dissent, right? North Korea. And here's the thing, if California does not pass yes on Prop 50 this November 4th, then California will be at the forefront of consenting to a consolidation of this power. Because again, Prop 50 is a temporary action before the 2030 census to rectify what Texas just did, which is eliminate 5 blue seats in order to have 5 red seats, right? What we're doing is we're rectifying that by positioning a temporary proposition that would give us 5 seats, right? That's an equal reset. But what Republicans in California want you to think is, think of the ethics, think of democracy, think about us. You know, the thing is that they care about fairness in California, but they don't care about fairness in the country, right? And that's the thing, because they will benefit from the country being MAGA. We won't benefit, but they want us to believe that we should be driven by our morality of democracy, right? But in fact, if they consolidate on that power, in fact, if they increase their numbers artificially through that of stealing seats, then they not only have extended power beyond 2026, but they possibly can have amendment power to reach permanent amendments like these things. In that reality, what we will need is a constitutional convention in order to be capable of removing all of their bullshit, right? But that is a very serious reality in which they have amendment power, right? And we cannot allow for that, which means that Californians have to go against what you think is right and go for what you think is best for the country. Under the Citizens Almanac, it says your responsibility is to the Constitution, to upholding those values, and that can come at the cost of ourselves temporarily, right? This is what Proposition 50 is. This is ensuring that we live for tomorrow by California sacrificing temporarily in order for us to forbid this administration from consolidating on power. But if Prop 50 fails, then we can be secure in the fact that we will turn like ABC. There's universities, UC Berkeley, who has handed over names of anti-EZ protesters to the government. There's UCLA, who wanted to bend the knee to the billion-dollar lawsuit. You see, these are a reality in which our state will be a filter for red policy if you do not vote yes on Prop 50, but also if you do not demand from our governor to, one, sign the two ICE bills, the first one that bans masks and the second one that requires name IDs. The compromise is the mask ban, right? And also demand that the governor start to strategize for the soft secession of California. Because at the end of the day, unless we temporarily disconnect from North Korea, we will become North Korea. And that's the thing. I'm not talking about full-on secession, but I'm talking about using the threat of secession, disconnecting temporarily, to force the federal to actually restore constitutional integrity, right? So the goal isn't necessarily to disconnect, but to pressure them to know that we can disconnect. If they say that the Constitution is optional, then so is our obedience to a union, right? Because that's only possible through the Constitution. So in this reality, in order to defend and to protect the Constitution, we need to disconnect from the federal because they are eroding the Constitution. That starts with ending federal funding. California needs to begin that. We're going to be scared of the consequences, but as you see with Jimmy Fallon, the consequences are coming. It's a question of whether or not we're willing to fight against what's inevitable. They're going to fight against any sort of resistance, right? Let's think of the White Rose in Germany, right? They were unalived. Guillotines were built for them. Why? Because they wrote texts against the administration, right? So now reality, no matter what you do, even if you say, he sucks, you can be martial lawed, right? They're not going to call it that. But at least you know that you shouldn't go out to protest because then there may be real martial law. But already you're not saying anything because you're censored through fake martial law, right? So ultimately you need to recognize that whether or not you go out on the streets and protest, you're going to be harmed. But that's the thing. When they start picking up all the protesters who are willing to protest and you're not there because you're scared to protest, who will protest for you? That's the thing. Because you didn't do it because it wasn't you. But now no one's going to be able to do it for you because they already took all the protesters who would have done it.